Hello everybody and welcome to this week's webinar, which is an introduction to VBA, and it's going to be led this week by Todd Brannon. Now Todd's led a session with us before, and it was excellent. It was on Excel actually, and I think that many of you probably have seen it, but for those of you who haven't, Todd is something of an expert, particularly with VBA. Today he's going to start with the basics just so that everybody begins on the same footing, and from there it may be that we do more sessions working kind of on more difficult parts later on. I think to be honest, it's probably the easiest thing if I just pass straight on to Todd, because for me this is going to be a big learning curve today. I don't really know much about VBA, and I'm really looking forward to changing that. So with that in mind, yeah, Todd, I'd like to pass on to you if that's okay.
Sounds good. You can hear me okay, right?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Right.
If anybody can just in the questions box, just let us know that you're hearing everything properly. That would be great, just so that we know moving forward.
All right. Hello, everybody.
Great.
I just wanted to, first of all, thank James for having me again. Had a lot of fun doing the last webinar, and when he asked me to do one about VBA, I got really excited. This is something that, just to kind of tell you a little bit about myself, I actually made a major career change back in 2009. I went from working in the clinical world, working in hospitals, assisting anesthesiologists and anesthetists, going to the corporate world and becoming an analyst. And so once I became an analyst, that was my first introduction to using Excel kind of on a daily basis. So with that, over the years in those analyst roles, I began to see some challenges that I would view these challenges and see there's got to be a better way to do things. Is there a faster, more efficient way to do it? Can I automate this? And especially in the past probably 3 years, and certainly last year and a half, that's really accelerated just because the more I've learned, the more I begin to see these challenges as a problem solver and see that I know just from my experience as I grow in my VBA skill set, this has got to be possible. I may not know at that time what that solution really is, but I know enough to know how to kind of research it. And I say all that not to be self-deprecating and be, this false humility. What I'm saying is, if I can do it, you can do it. I know it's a cliche, but the truth of the matter is the more you learn, the more you begin to think in terms of solving problems with VBA, and the possibility is there. You just have to know how to kind of where to go to research it and kind of work with it. And so I hope today, or my hope is today, to kind of expose you to some of the basics, just to give you sort of a springboard if you've never even been exposed to VBA, to see kind of how fun it can be to automate some of the basic things that you do in Excel already, and then just to see the possibilities. Some of these examples are real basic, and you may not even see the practical use of it. The point is to see that you can automate a lot of the manual things that you do, just down to typing a string into a cell, or typing a number, copying and pasting, and that kind of thing. So without further ado, one of the first things that you need to consider is, now I'm in Excel 2016, so it may look a little different if you've got 2013 or 2010 or even previous versions, but the concept is still the same. What you want to look for is the developer tab first and foremost. This is where you're going to be living when it comes to VBA, because in this section here, the code section, this is what's important. And we're going to be working with 3 things here in the code section. We're going to be working with the Visual Basic Editor. We're going to look at the macros window, and then we're going to actually record a macro to get us started. Now, if you don't have a developer tab, if you happen to be looking at your version of Excel or your application while we're going through this, the way to find that, I don't think out of the box Microsoft Office or Microsoft Excel comes with the developer tab already shown. So just in case, go to your File tab, and then what you want to do is go down to Options, and then on the Options, the Excel Options window, click on Customize Ribbon, and you'll notice over here in the on this right-hand side, you can see all the tabs that are activated in my workbook or my application. And the developer tab's right there. Now, if it's not on yours, you can go to this left side and go find commands not in the ribbon from the drop-down, and you should be able to find that developer in this list. And once you do, if you highlight it, you can just click Add, and then just make sure the box is checked once you add it so it's activated, and it'll be visible in your ribbon. So simple enough. You can't go much anywhere until you have your developer tab, and I know a lot of times out of the box when you install the Excel app or Office app, it's not actually the developer tab isn't actually present on your ribbon out of the box. So we've got that out of the way. So let's go back to this code section. The three things we talked about, we got the Visual Basic editor. So here, actually, let me close this, go to book one. So notice I've already got a blank workbook open, this book one. So in this window here, your VBA project window, you'll see I've got some other things in here. I've got my personal XLSB workbook open. Whatever workbooks are open will show in this. And in fact, let me do something to make this a little less confusing. Well, it's still showing. Nevertheless, what we want to look at is book one. And I've got a function, a user-defined function. Actually, that leads me to a good point. So VBA can be used for macros, which is what we're going to talk about today, just basic macros. But there's also functions, user-defined functions that you can develop using VBA. So, for instance, this function here, I developed to actually become an actual function. If you know about functions like sum or product or the if functions, the built-in functions in Excel, you can actually create your own, and that's what this is. It uses VBA. We won't get into creating user-defined functions today, but just know that you can use VBA to do that as well. We're going to stick, the scope of our discussion is going to be just macros. You can also use VBA to create and develop your own user forms and things like that. So there's a pretty great depth you can go into once you learn VBA about doing different things, not just automating using macros, but also, like I said, creating your own user functions, creating user forms and things like that. So back to my point. So we have book one here, and in your VBA project window, you'll always have the workbooks here, and then what it shows you are your objects in this folder here. So we've got one sheet in this book, and then it shows this workbook. And another thing you can do with VBA is you can create what are called workbook events, and you can actually open a VBA editor for your workbook here, and then develop VBA solutions that are based on workbook events. Like if you wanted something to happen, or you wanted to set forth some actions automatically when you open this workbook, that would be like a workbook event. But we're going to stick strictly with modules. And so what we do is we click on this Microsoft Excel objects, and then right click and go to Insert and Insert Module. And so now we have module one, and this is where all your macros would live within modules. And you can create as many modules as you want. but this is the editor in which you actually write the code. Now that you know that, let me move this over here. We'll go back to this code section of our developer tab, and we'll go to record macros. Now you can actually turn this recorder on, and you can actually perform some actions in your worksheet. It will actually record those actions into a macro. And so let's do that, and let's see what happens with the code, just to kind of get an initial exposure to the VBA code. So what we'll do is we'll click on this, and it brings up this dialog box. So you can change the name of your macro. It names it macro 1 by default. It's the first macro for this workbook. We can leave it at that. We can change the name. Just make sure you kind of follow a naming convention that has no spaces between your words. So if you wanted to say my first macro, you would have to make sure it's all one string of text. Or if you wanted to space in there, you could just use a underscore just to make sure it's a contiguous string of text. And we'll leave it at that, or actually I can go back to macro 1, or I'll leave it like that. The other thing that you can do is it gives you the option to create a shortcut key for your macros. So what that means is if you choose a shortcut, a keyboard shortcut for this, it will run the macro when you press that keyboard shortcut. So we can put let's do Control-Shift-W, and notice how it adds that in the shortcut key. Then the next line is where are you going to store this macro. So if you have multiple workbooks open, it will give you the option. Like here, I've got my personal workbook, personal macro workbook open, and then then we have this workbook. So we're going to leave it at that. And then here you can type a description, and this will just type my first macro. And what this will do, and you'll see here in a minute, it will add a comment into the macro code itself. So if you want to create a comment in there to help you remember when you come back to it what it was for, what it was supposed to do, this is where you would do that. So we're going to click OK. And now this box up here has turned blue. And notice when I hover over it, it says stop recording, record a macro. That means it's currently recording. And also down in the lower left-hand corner here of your workbook, there's this little square, and if you hover over it, you can see a macro is currently recording. Click to stop recording. So we are recording right now. So any action that I make, like I move the cursor to another cell here, it will record that action. Now I can type in, we'll type in something like hello. And then I'll hit enter, and we'll stop recording. And what happened here was when I went to record a macro, it actually opened a new module, module 2. And so if you double click that, you'll see exactly what we just recorded here. And so here's our macro name. We changed that in that dialog box. Then here's our comments. And what it does is basically comments out the macro name, and then remember in the description we typed my first macro. It adds that to the comments, and then of course it tells us the keyboard shortcut we chose. Now, comments are always highlighted in green, and the way you make a comment is you start the line with a single quote. And what a comment is not an actual piece of the code. So it enables you to make notes in your code, and Excel will actually skip these lines when it executes the rest of the code. And this is very important, especially starting out. Just make comments for yourself. If you have to do it line by line, I've got some macros that I write that I have to do it line by line because it tends to get so complicated that I really need to have that if I come back to it down the road and I need to change something, or maybe there's an error or the code breaks. It helps me remember what was this supposed to do, and maybe helps me get to resolving the issue. So again, to make a comment, you always just start the line with the single quote, and then everything after that will be highlighted in green. And everything you see highlighted in green is a comment that just means it's not executed within the code. So back to what we did. Let me explain this. So the range object can be used to identify a cell, a range of cells. This could be the entire column, and you could write it like this. And what that, after the dot here, is the method. I hope I'm using my terminology right. But what you want to know about that is after you've selected the range, like B3, like we did, the select means that what we did was we clicked on cell B3 to select it. And then the next line of code here, selection just basically means what was selected the previous line. So this is basically code for saying cell B3. And then, so it recorded every action I did. So I was on B3. I hit Control left. So what happened was, with B3 selected, I hit Control left, and so this end with the XL to left basically recorded what I did when I hit Control left arrow. And if any of you remember, I think we went over that as a keyboard shortcut on the previous webinar a few weeks ago. That Control left just moves you all the way over to the left from the cell that you're currently selected. And so it selected that cell, which would have been A3. And then I did the same thing. I did Control up, and so it recorded that action by saying selection, end, XL up within the parentheses, and then it selected cell A1. And so the next action we did was we added the string hello. We typed in hello into A1. And so this is how Excel records it. So it uses the active cell object, and then the formula R1C1 is the method of using relative cell references. And we're not going to get deep into this. I'm just showing you what Excel recorded. I'm actually going to show you how to actually develop this same code from scratch in a much simpler fashion. I just wanted to show you how to record a macro and what the code actually comes out to look like. But this is a method where you could actually input a formula into a cell, and by default, when Excel records a macro, it uses the same method to just input a string. And as long as it's in double quotes, it will print it out to that cell as a string. And then once I hit enter, it went to cell A2 and then selected that. As you can see here, that's the active cell. So now that you've seen what a macro kind of looks like, and hopefully I've explained it clearly enough, some of this is somewhat complicated, especially if you're brand new to it. Let's actually look at how to develop a macro from scratch manually that performs the same action. So the first thing I could do, and I can stay on this same module, all I need to do is use the naming convention sub, which stands for sub procedure, and then type in a title I want for the macro. And I can just say macro 2. And then a double parentheses comes after your macro name, and then when you hit enter, it will automatically autofill the end sub, which is required at the end of your sub procedure or your macro. And notice how when I did that, Excel created a line in between the end of the first sub procedure and my new macro. So everything in between sub and end sub is where all your code goes, or your comments. So I can type a comment and say, well, we'll say second macro, right? Just to show you, kind of reiterate how to type a comment. And you notice once I hit enter, it highlights it in green. So let me go back to the actual workbook here. Let me clear that. So we're going to start from scratch. So to do the same thing, I can type in a range. Remember the range object here, and I will actually, I'm going to tell Excel what cell I want you to select to input the text hello. So we'll go ahead and select A1 in double quotes inside the parentheses and then dot. Now I can do this like Excel recorded it. I'll do select, and then you can actually test this. So let's stop right here. I can go to the top of my macro, and to run the macro you can either click on this run button, or as you can see here it tells you you can press F5 to run it. So I can press F5. Notice here that we've got cell B3 selected currently. So when I run this, when I hit F5, I should see this selector go to A1. So we'll go ahead and hit F5, and sure enough, it worked. So that's, I mean, writing a macro is that simple. That's a very simple, almost, meaningless procedure. But the point is, you can automate almost every manual action you can think of using a macro. You just have to know how to do it. So we've got that kind of settled. The other thing I wanted to show you is you can also use F8 to step through a macro. F5 just runs it from beginning to end. So if I hit F8, it highlights that first line, and then I hit F8 again, it goes to the next line of code. Now it's currently highlighting that line of code. Doesn't mean it's executed. It means the next time you hit F8, it will execute that highlighted line of code. So as we do that, sure enough, you can see over on the left-hand side in the worksheet itself that it now has selected cell A1, and then hit F8 once again, and we're done. So F5 runs the entire macro. F8 allows you to step through it line by line, which can be extremely useful when you're just kind of testing or troubleshooting, that kind of thing. So we can go to the next line of code, and we can kind of do what the macro recorder already did. So we'll use selection and then value. Instead of using the formula R1C1 method, we'll use value equals hello. And remember, if it's a string that you want to put in a cell, you do have to enclose it in double quotes. And so let's walk through this, F8, and there you go. So you've seen two different methods of how to do the same thing already in VBA. And a lot of times you'll find as you begin to use VBA and write your own macros that some of the code that you see in recorded macros tends to be a little bit superfluous, if you will, I guess. And it's just done that way by default. I don't know the real specific reasons why. I'm sure there are some reasons. But this just shows you right here how you can do what we did recording the macro with basically 2 lines of code. And in fact, I can do this in 1 line of code if I remove the selection piece here. Let me clear this. And we'll just hit F5. And there you go. So you can actually do what Excel did in a few, I mean, some of this was my fault because I was moving the cursor around. So it's not really fair to say it was an actual, necessary 5 lines of code. But this select and selection, you may find yourself using that a lot, but you'll also find that that's a little, it'll kind of make your code bloated because you don't always need to use that. So you can just see here how 1 line of code is all that's necessary to do what we did. And in fact, let me just show you, you can continue on, like say cell A2. Let's just use a number. And so if we wanted to put a number in a cell, since it's not a string, it does not require double quotes. Sorry about that. So there you have it. It's really that simple. Just one of the basic ideas to learn in VBA is this range object, and you know, you're going to probably run into, as you kind of dig deeper into VBA, you may run into some issues where you don't know what cell you want to select. So, but I'm just kind of sticking to it simple here, and we're going to, you know, just there are other methods to do this. You can use the cells method. I can just show you that real quick. Remember, I think I'm doing this right. Cells one select. And so let me walk through this. Yeah. So the cells method basically works off of a row and column identifier idea. So cells 1, 1 means row 1, column 1, and we know that to be otherwise cell A1. So this is basically another way of saying range A1. In fact, just to reiterate, let's try. Oops, oh, there. So if you run that, cells 2, 2 is B2, and the reason is it's row 2, column 2. And so we use the same method here for cells to input a value into the cell as we did with the range objects. So 2 ways of doing that as well. That's something that can be very helpful as well down the road. Another, while I'm thinking about it, another one while we're on the cells property or cells object, you can actually use that to, there's another method called offset. And I won't get too much deeper, but if we choose cells 2, 2, which is B2, where we currently have the text howdy, we can use what's called offset. And what this does is we can tell it how many rows and how many columns from our initial cell or our initial range, which is indicated by cells 2, 2 here. And what I'll do is I'll just use a 1 and a 1, which means I want to go offset from that 1 row down and 1 column to the right. And then we'll just hit select, or we can do this. Let's do this just so we can see it in action. So I'll run the macro again. And so notice here now we have high in cell C3. Now let me go back. I know this is, I'm moving pretty fast, and if you've never looked at this before, you've never seen this before, I don't want to lose you. So from cell B2, which we selected using the cells property, or cells object, I think I'm getting that right. Cells 2, 2, so that's B2. We've used that as a reference point, and then the dot offset means we want to go 1 row down and 1 column to the right, and then input the value high. Now, we can select negative values as well. I can actually put in a -1, and what that means is we will now offset one row up rather than one row down from our reference cell and then one column over. So if I run this again, we should see the high show up in cell C2. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry, I meant C1. Sorry about that. So one row, I was thinking C3 was our reference cell, and it should have been B2. So one row up, the -1 gets us up to row 1, and the positive 1 for the second value is one row to the right. So I hope you guys kind of understand that, kind of get a sense of how to move around, how to change cells kind of as a starting point. But let's move on. Wanted to show you something about how to work with multiple worksheets. So we just have one sheet right now. What if you wanted to automate the process of adding a new sheet? That's actually pretty simple. So let's start a new macro. And we'll just stick with this simple naming convention, macro 3. And then I'll put a comment how to open a new sheet. So this is going to take us to a new property called sheets. So we'll say we have one sheet right now. If we use this sheets property, all we do is type in sheets, then dot, and you notice how these different methods show up automatically because Excel recognizes that sheets property. So we'll just click, or we'll just type in add, I'm sorry. And it's that simple. If you want to add a new sheet, you just type sheets.add. So let's run that by clicking F5, and notice now how we have a new sheet, sheet 2. And so what do you do when you have multiple sheets now? If you want to go back and forth and toggle between sheets to perform some different action, you want to do what's called activate that sheet. So we have 2 sheets now. You can see up here in the VBA project window where we just had one sheet before, we now have 2 sheets. And what it does here is sheet 1, that first sheet 1 is the actual code sheet name, the Excel code, I think I'm saying that right. And then the second one in the parentheses is actually the tab name. So if we actually change this tab, say we'll make it second for the second sheet. If I hit enter, you'll notice here now in the VBA project window, it's changed that in the parentheses. And so we can refer to these sheets either way. And so we'll still use the sheets property. And then we can, in parentheses, after sheets, we want to identify the sheet that we want to work with here. So we'll use the name of our new worksheet, and then we will use the activate method. And so what that's telling Excel to do is when we run this macro, if we happen to be on sheet 1, we want it to now go to sheet 2 and activate that worksheet. So like we used before, the sheets property, sheets.add, that added a new sheet. Now we're identifying in a workbook with multiple sheets which one we want to activate by using the sheets method, and then naming it. The actual name of the tab goes between double quotes. So if we hit F5, notice that it has now activated that second worksheet. Now, knowing what we know here in the VBA project window, we can also refer to that as sheet 2. When we do so, it doesn't go in parentheses. I mean, it doesn't go in double quotes. And, oh, actually, let's back up. When you use the code sheet name, that sheet 2, you don't actually have to use the sheets property. So I will use sheet 2 dot activate. And then we'll comment this out. And just so you know, that can be a very useful tool to comment out a piece of code if you're testing different methods or you're testing different ideas. You don't have to actually delete it, so Excel doesn't execute it. You can actually just comment it out, because remember, comments are lines within your code that aren't executed. They're just there as notes to help you. So I do that a lot. So what we'll do is go back to sheet 1, make sure that's activated, and we'll run this. Click F5, and sure enough, it activated the worksheet that has the tab name second, because we use the code sheet name, which is sheet 2. And when you do that, you don't have to actually use the sheets method like we did for this first method that we used. So it's 2 different ways to navigate between multiple worksheets. Most of the time, I use this method just because sometimes it's easier to know, what your tab names are, and you'd have to go to the VBA project. If you've got something with a lot of sheets, if you just know the name of the sheet, this is a simpler method. But just know you can use both. So what about if you wanted to open or add a new workbook? We can use the workbook method. So let's start another macro. And then we'll use, like we use the sheets method, there's a workbook method. And it's the same action. It's dot add. And so let's run this F5. Oops. I'm sorry, it's not workbook, it's workbooks. All right, so it's the workbooks method, not workbook. So we'll hit F5, and sure enough, Excel opens up a new workbook for you. So now you can see we've got book 1 and we've got book 2. And then you can actually, I won't get into that. So open up, so we've opened up a new workbook. The next thing, I know I'm using up a lot of my time here. So the next thing I wanted to kind of show you is how to make things a little simpler by using variables. So, we've walked through how to add text or a number value to a cell. There's actually, let's go back to this macro here. So now I want to make things a little simpler. I can actually use variables instead of typing in these strings and things like that. So to declare a variable, you use this DIM, and it means dimensioned, to dimension a variable or to declare a variable. So what we can do is we can dimension, say, hello as a variable, and we'll do string. So there's different data types for variables, and I'll just keep it simple. I won't cover them all, but for this particular situation, we're going to dimension hello as a string. And this is going to be kind of redundant. The whole point is I'm just trying to show you how you can use variables to do the same thing instead of typing out the actual values. And then what I'll do is hello equals hello. And so instead of using the actual string value, the literal string, I'll now use the variable. And I'm just going to stop this here. I can run it. I can actually step through it by clicking or pushing F8. But I'm just going to put a stop here. And in this column here, I'm sorry, if you left click, it will create a stop point, and you just turn it off by re-clicking it. So what this will do is if I press F5 to run this code, it won't run it any further than this last line here. So I'm on, okay, so I hit F5 and it ran that code. And notice it actually input the string hello by using the variable. Now I could have named this variable anything. And in fact, let me just do this. Let me do variable one, var1. And then we will change this here. And then I'm going to change it here. And so let me run it again. Let me clear this. And again, we have hello. So what's so great about that? What's the big deal? Well, it can be a very big deal, because if you need to refer to that same variable throughout your code, you don't have to retype. Say you have 10 instances in a macro where you're referring to this same value. You don't have to type it in 10 different times. What if you want to change that? All you got to do is change your variable value here. So if I change it there, it's going to now change it here in this value automatically. Well, that didn't work right. What happened? Oh, there it is. I've got two worksheets open, so I shouldn't really be doing that. I hope I'm not confusing you guys. Let me close that. Let's run this again. Okay, so back to that. You can change this variable all day long in one spot. And if I, like for instance, I'm try to drive this point home, because this can be really powerful. Let's stop this, and then so look, so here's what I've done. So I've got 3 different places where I need to place hi. But I don't want to retype that every time. If I needed to change that back to hello, if I declare a variable and use a variable, I've got to retype it 1 time rather than 3. So if I run this, there you've got hello in all those 3 spots. I can change it to something like that 1 time. And there you go. That's the real power of variables. It can help simplify things in such a way that will just kind of change your approach. So I wanted to make sure I got to that. Let me look at my list here. You can actually declare a range as a variable too. This is pretty useful as well. Let's come down here. So we'll dim my range, as range. Because range is a data type. And then when you use the data type range, you have to actually use the method of setting the variable, and you won't always remember this. I don't always remember this. It'll just throw an error, and that'll be a reminder that, oh, I've got to type set before I set it to a value. So once I've declared the variable, I can set it to equal range A1. And so when I select, or I can go to my range, value equals hello. I actually should have done that in the other macro. So there you can see you can actually use, you can declare your range as a variable as well. And so if you have all these places where you have, you need to go to a specific range, you can use one variable name to refer to that. And if you needed to change that, again, it's about simplifying your code. So if you have a reference to that range in several places in your code, it can be very meticulous to try and find those places to make any changes. If you wanted to change that to A2, you just declare and set a variable, and you've got to change it once here at the beginning of your code. And so I hope you kind of see the value in that. We could actually use, let me show you one more thing. Again, I've been using ranges that were just one cell, so let me show you how you can actually declare a range of more than one cell and have 5. And so you can see how it's selected A1 to A10. So these are all really simple techniques that I know I got kind of deep on a couple of things, but I tried to stay pretty surface level, just to kind of initial exposure to VBA, so you'd have something to kind of make some quick notes on and go back and play with and practice with and kind of get used to it and see that it's really kind of fun. It's really cool to know that there's all these methods that you can use to automate pretty much anything you've ever done manually. And if you have, recurring processes, that's really what got me started into it. Was in my roles as an analyst, I would have reporting processes that were just so repetitive that took hours and sometimes days, that if you just spent the time to develop the VBA code to basically automate all the manual pieces of the process, it's amazing how you can reduce all that work down to just clicking a button or just starting a macro. So there's other ways to automate this stuff. I didn't really get into like creating a button that you could click to run a macro. I think I alluded to Workbook Events earlier, which that's really cool because you can actually develop VBA code that initializes when you open a workbook. There's VBA code that you can create forms and dialog boxes to open files, to save files in certain ways, and that's pretty deep. But I mean, just to kind of just show you, there's so many places you can go with this. There's so many things you can do with it, and I hope a lot of these little tricks that I've shown you, just kind of surface level introduction to VBA. I mean, there's so many things I could have shown you. It's still basic stuff. I've barely scratched the surface, but I hope it's enough to kind of inspire you guys to kind of do a little more research or go back and just play with this stuff, practice it, record macros, and then go back and look at the macro and kind of examine it, and then even if you don't understand the code, take some of it and do some research on it, maybe learn a little more about what Excel is actually doing with that code. I mean, you can watch it in the process and kind of get a sense for it, but some of the stuff might be a little bit confusing to you. Just research it and you'll learn more about this. So I know I've gone quite a ways into our time here, James, so I'll just I guess at this point it would be good to hand it back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a few minutes left for any questions. Somebody did actually just ask a question, which I was hoping to shoot over to you. It was from Peter Colopy. Yeah, I think that's right. The first thing I was going to say was that Peter's question is any recommendations on a book that provides additional VBA guidance and doesn't require a PhD. But before I pass that over to Todd, just a reminder that the Microsoft Excel course and the Advanced Excel course that you get with membership, they both cover VBAs. So there is learning there. But if you're looking for something, I don't know, alternative to that, I don't know if you have any ideas, Todd, yourself.
Well, I don't know that I have any specific ideas because I wouldn't want to lead anybody away from the resources available to members. I would say on books, though, I'm not a big book guy, only because in the digital age, it's so much faster and more efficient to, I mean, I'll even say this, just do a Google search. Books, and a lot of times, VBA hasn't changed much over the years. I don't know how much it's changed. Like I said, I've only been using it for a handful of years, so I don't even really feel like I have enough experience to even know what changes and how fast it changes. So books can be helpful, but then again, it just depends on your learning style too. I kind of learn based on what I need rather than learning it just for the sake of learning it. But I know some other people have different learning styles, and learning it from the ground up, just that way works for them. That's not just not how I think. I look at a problem or I look at an issue, go, I need this to do this. Now I just need to figure out how do I get from point A to point B. So I'm not a book guy, but I'm not going to say that's not a good way to go. But that said, I just doesn't put me in a position to make any good recommendations, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that anyway, Todd. Yeah, as I say, Peter, we do have those resources available, and if you are interested in kind of further learning, and if anybody else who's on the webinar at the moment is and just wants to pop it in the question box, it's really good feedback for us moving forward, because it means that we can bring you more of the content that you'd like to listen to in these live classes. Also, if anybody else has any questions, please do go ahead and pop them in the question box. Janet's just mentioned something. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's great, Janet. Janet just said that she's learned bits as she needed them, but wants to make sure that she's not missing any basics. So would be interested in future webinars. So I think that I'm sure Todd would be as interested in, as I would in doing more of these, because VBA is a hugely expansive thing. I mean, for me, it was hugely interesting. I took a lot from it. Particularly, one of the bits that I enjoyed was the variables. I thought that was a great.
Yeah, variables changed my life because I remember I used to write code that was there. It was a monster, and I would get done with it, and then tweaking it or
Yeah.
troubleshooting it was just so massive. And variables changed my life. And I would go back to that last comment. I think one of the ways that I learn the best is kind of project based. I mean, I've already mentioned that usually it's more about me seeing a problem or a challenge that I have that kind of focuses my research on what do I need to learn to do this. But I think that's a great point, is to come up with, maybe a specific problem or challenge or project type of curriculum that I've learned so much that I didn't expect to learn when I would sit down with a tutorial or a series of video tutorials that might be how to create a user form, or how to create a user form that you can add records to a database and that kind of thing. And there's always something in that, little bits and pieces of methods and things like that I can use with other challenges that I had no expectation of learning. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. I'd also like to say, or at least ask, really, Todd, whether this applies. But for me, I mean, I do a lot of work with HTML and CSS, and that's different. But one of the things that I feel is kind of anecdotally similar is that I think that really you can't. Nothing is better than practice when you're coding.
Oh,
That's the way
absolutely.
that you're going to learn the fastest.
Absolutely. And that's what I think that's a really good point, because I think in the last year and a half to 3 years, I've seen my own skill set like grow exponentially. So it's the more that I'm in it, the more that I'm doing, the more that I'm developing to create solutions, my learning just took off. And the more you learn, the more I think you absorb faster. And I
Yeah.
think you can probably say the same when it comes to HTML, CSS. The more you do it, the more you use, you seem to absorb more new skills much faster, much quicker.
Mm.
It just kind of seems to snowball.
Yeah, it's just taking those daunting steps when it looks like something that you're never going to get your head around. I think that with practice you can quickly do that, and then get to the more interesting parts of how you can really use what you've learned.
Right.
Um, yeah, it's 26 minutes past. I think that we'll probably leave it there unless anybody has any other questions. Karen just popped in that she was late. Karen, I can quite happily send you a link to the webinar for anybody else who wants to rewatch, maybe take some notes. Yeah, please send me an email at info@webinarsteam.com, and I can send you an email with the recording once that goes up. So yeah, thanks so much, Todd. That was really great. I look forward to hopefully doing some more stuff on VBA, and I hope that everybody else got a lot from it, and has been able to learn a little bit moving forward. So thanks a lot, everybody, and thanks, Todd.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Great, I'm really pleased. And to everybody, have a good weekend. I think this may be the last webinar before Christmas as well. So if that happens to be the case, yeah, Merry Christmas, everybody. Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, Merry Christmas to you as well, Todd.
Thank you. Merry
All right.
Christmas.
Well, thanks a lot, everybody, and goodbye.